Alastair. Hey, congratulations on your new short film, Pearls.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and really looking forward to freaking people out about oysters.
I know you just had a recent film festival with Motel X. With that, how was that audience reception to this short film so far?
Yeah, I'd say the main thing I keep being told is, wow, that was absolutely disgusting. Well done. That's my the main bit of feedback I'm getting. But no, people seem to be really enjoying the film. We're at a festival in the UK just last weekend where we won a best cinematography, and the guy who awarded it to us was a Dean Cundy, known
Hmm.
for Jurassic Park fame. So that was quite a win.
That is quite a win, and he's such a great gentleman. I spoke to him, a few times myself.
Amazing.
But let's start with that obligatory question. Where the original idea came from for pearls.
Yeah, sure. So originally, basically, what happened was my brother was telling me a story about him and my dad went to Scotland. They'd been doing some walking and they decided to celebrate with a plate of oysters. And one of them was the words he used was thick and very foamy. Uh, my dad, obviously being the good father, was like, "Well, you better eat that then," which he did. But just the image, I was like, "Well, what does that mean? What is a thick, foamy oyster?" Basically, what it turns out is that it was a fertile oyster. So my brother basically went and ate a mouthful of oyster eggs, which I didn't know was a thing. And I was just like, that is so horrific. I've got to think of like some kind of film around this. And then sort of went quite quickly from, okay, why do people eat oysters? They're not, well, they're known as aphrodisiacs, or they sort of are considered aphrodisiacs. So I was like, great, okay, my main character, they're eating the oysters to help with their impotence or whatever. But as I was doing more research into, I guess, why you maybe eat oysters or sort of like just aphrodisiacs in general, I was noticing how my social media just started targeting me like quite aggressively, saying things like, okay, you're impotent. You need to take this pill. You have no hair. You need to take this pill. Your testosterone is low. Take this pill. And it sort of just helped really like craft what I thought the backbone of the story would be. It's sort of how not just men, obviously women as well. In fact, women get this a lot, but men are now being targeted by this kind of like aggressive, you're not a man, you're not man enough. Take this pill and it will fix all your issues. But what are these pills? Like, you know, fine, something on the internet says it will help me, but should I necessarily do that? And that's kind of where the basic idea came from. It was sort of how someone falls down the trap of believing that something that's too good to be true can cure your issues, and then sort of the devastating effects it can have on the people around you.
It's funny as we're discussing this, I'm looking at my phone whether that's actually listening, and if I'm going to go on social media and I'm going to get all these ads for either oysters, pills, or zinc. I have no idea. But in this case, you know, you managed to turn this into sort of like into the horror genre, and I could already tell that you love horror just by the shirt and the poster in the background. Tell us about it. This into
Yeah.
this venture.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like horror is a genre that sort of, it always comes in waves. And I feel like right now we're in like a really interesting wave for horror where you've got things like Bring Her Back, Together, The Substance, obviously, like especially body horror, the fear of yourself is really, I think right now it's more pertinent than probably ever in a lot of ways. And to me, you know, it's strange because I love horror, but what I love are things that are weird, and horror is the perfect angle into that. There was a TV show in the UK years ago called The League of Gentlemen, which is basically it's a comedy, but with some of the most horrific things happening, and
Mhm.
it's just so weird, so out there, and it's always kind of like that genre has always kind of appealed to me. And like a lot of the films I made before, I'd say were more dark comedies, but with horror elements in them. And Pearls was the first one where I felt like I could lean a bit more into horror as a genre. In a lot of ways, I wouldn't say it's a straight horror. Like I think there's bits of drama, but that's also what I think is great about body horror specifically, because a lot of those films are dramas. It's about a small issue in your life, a small relationship problem that just suddenly goes completely out of control and you can't turn back. And I think that's something that not just horror, but horror allows you to do that in a great way, like sort of investigate that sort of thing.
That is actually very interesting because you could have gone off in so many different subgenres of horror, and you chose body horror, and you're right. Body horror is something most recently has been, coming up to the forefront as a subgenre in the horror industry right
Yeah,
now.
definitely. And I mean, a lot of my biggest influences, like obviously John Carpenter, it's on the wall, or, David Cronenberg. But even Cronenberg's son, Brandon Cronenberg, was something like Possessor, like there's been, or Infinity Pool, that it just feels like body horror, not specifically, but this visceral feeling that you get from it that you don't really, I don't want to say you don't get from other films. Something like Weapons obviously had good scares, but there's something that really makes your body cringe when it's a body horror specifically.
Very true. Now, in order to make a body horror work, you have to bring in a good makeup artist. And so tell us about your collaboration on who you brought in, and tell us the truth whether if this was all makeup or a little bit of CGI mixed into this.
Yeah, okay. So I have to admit, like it was so I don't think I'd have made the film if I didn't meet this person. Obviously, I had a producer who believed in the idea, but my production designer, this guy called Alava Brantes, who he's doing a lot of really cool production design stuff right now. He designed the lightsaber on the Acolyte. Like he's, really, really cool guy. And he was the first person who convinced me that actually what I'd written was even feasible. When you write a lot of these ideas, you're kind of like, well, how am I going to even pull this off? And he was the first guy who was like, yeah, I know this amazing makeup artist. She wants to really get into more like designing more prosthetics. And an oyster in general is such a visceral image. Like there's a lot of really cool makeup ideas you can get from it. And in terms of your second question, the VFX, the only fake bit of the whole film, because everything else, all of the makeup was done on set. The only bits that were fake, ironically, are the wallpaper in certain scenes, and at the very end, not to spoil the film, but when they look at I guess the oyster creature, one of its eyes, we had to CGI its eye moving, but everything else we did on set. And to me, that's super important. I feel if people on set don't think something's gross and believable, why would they think it in your film?
So how much thought did you actually work with your makeup artist to come up with that look? Because when we're thinking of oysters, we know what oysters look like, but a transformation, that is quite an imagination.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of, I feel like the great thing about being sort of the writer and director, obviously, is like, yeah, but you build sort of like, so I'd already written a lot of the details, like the shell on the arm, sort of like the way the skin looked. I'd kind of already imagined, and then you hand it over to your production design team to see what they can create. And I was sharing references to things like Society or The Blob. In fact, we looked at something like Chernobyl as well. Like, obviously that one specific episode where you see the damage radiation can do. That was a huge influence. And like what what we managed to pull off was like, okay, we'll mix all these ideas together. And I'd say we spent, I was there when they were doing the castings. We had to do like 3D scans, like to make sure that everything looked right. The scariest thing was when the makeup artist said, look, we've only got one shot on the day to actually hope this works. And it did. And, that was prep, months of work, meeting, sharing ideas. So it was quite intense to pull that off. And again, I think when I'd first written the script, there was a lot more on camera, for example. But I think one of the cool things, just with any horror or any genre thrillers, it's what you don't see. So you don't see the beginning of her transformation in the bathroom. You sort of see the end result, or we don't show you what happens to Tony until you see him in the lab at the end. So we sort of planned it very carefully that we were like, we know how far the makeup will get us and it will freak people out. But the moment you linger too much is when you're kind of undercutting it.
Now, correct me if I'm going on the wrong direction. Did you keep the same production designer for this project onto this, and And can you talk about the props that was actually designed?
Yeah, I mean, um, he kind of hated me for a little bit because one of the last scenes, we have this giant fish tank, effectively, with these big oyster shells. And he was like, "Oh, could we have a smaller tank? Could we do this?" And I was like, "I'll let you change a lot of things, mate." And I stuck with him from the beginning. He's an amazing guy to work with. But I was like, "Look, that has to be there. That's the one thing that and the giant oyster shell." So he built this giant metal tank. They struggled to get it into the location. They just about managed it. But yeah, everything on screen. So like the oyster tanks that Marvin's first looking at in the lab, we made those out of cardboard and like these plastic trays. He built this real giant metal fish tank, which we filled with like gallons of water. The giant oyster on the wall, he took a small oyster, scanned it, 3D printed it. And then, like I said, we 3D scanned our actor and then took his 3D printed torso and stuck it into this giant oyster shell. In fact, I've still got it upstairs, so I walk in and it scares me every day.
That that is that is such a wonderful thing as as working on indie projects like this, as half the time, unless you have producers who paid for it, that you hopefully you get to keep some of the souvenirs that you
Exactly.
made.
I mean, my girlfriend who also produces wasn't too happy when I brought home the well, definitely the body, which is in the oyster. She wasn't very happy with me for a while, but it's now part of the family.
Now, Alistair, tell us what got you started into filmmaking for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always like even when I was younger, sort of loved the idea of in any way possible, like telling stories, be like writing something or whatever. But like a key moment, and it is a moment where I was suddenly like, I'm gonna make a film, whatever happens, was I was funny enough up in Scotland. My uncle lives there. It was about 2 in the morning. I snuck out and I saw him watching The Thing, uh, and he was like, "Oh, come watch! It's an amazing film." And just by the end of it, I was just like, "This is just I've never seen anything like this before. Like, this is this even possible?" So that was sort of like the bug that got me. Then I did sort of like I did like a film theory degree. I did like a little bit of film school, and then afterwards I've met so many awesome collaborators and people who seem to sort of like these horrific ideas I come up with that yeah, so just sort of managed to sort of go from there and just like build a team of great collaborators. My cinematography, Giovanni, I met him about 10 years ago. We've worked on every film together. And we sort of always push each other to be like, well, what's next? Because it's easy sometimes to get not disheartened, that's not the right word. I feel like after COVID, you're coming out of this weird sort of few years where like you made films and then you stop for a bit because the world stops and then it's like okay but let's get going again and yeah I'd say that's sort of what's how I've got to this point and but no, the first moment was definitely The Thing. That just seeing that film that just changed my life.
So you said you have the love of genre of that horror genre since the beginning, and it doesn't sound like you ever left.
No, I mean look I feel like you have to respect and love all like genres where you can of course but horror weird genre stuff. That's always been my something that's appealed to me. I mean, the last film I did was basically about a guy who does yoga who rips in half. So I already had this like I want to make these weird horror things, but with a bit of comedy. I mean, even Pearls, it's dark, but there is an absurd humor to it, and I don't want to go stray too far from that. Like some things can just be grim for the sake of being grim, and I feel actually even in your darkest moments in a horror and life, there's always something funny.
Very true. Now you mentioned at the beginning that your this film actually got a cinematography award, and I do have to admit, that some of the shots, the close-up shots, are amazing. Can you talk about the process of creating those perfect shots just to bring out a little bit of fear into
Yeah.
the audience?
No, of course, yeah. Look, the best thing you can ever do, and everyone's always going to be like, "Oh, homage. You know, you're watching. You need to watch as many films as possible, get influences, and then for me, it's always weird when you're a writer director because in your head you're already visualizing a lot of these moments. So I had quite a clear idea from the start in terms of like, okay, we're going to have these shots here. I'd storyboarded everything before. I'd worked with my cinematographer for, maybe a few months just prepping everything. Then it's like, okay, what other horrors can you get influence from? Things like Videodrome, The Fly, of course. And then you're like, you don't want to copy them exactly, but you want to homage it in a nice way and sort of bring in that like an audience can kind of recognize something and be like, oh, that scared me in a previous picture or previous film. But we chose very specific lenses, like we shot with this crazy this like lens from the 1930s, so that whenever we had these like close-ups, it would give this sort of dreamy, ethereal but weird look as well. And I think one thing that I've noticed in terms of like why I chose certain things, like close-ups, getting in as close as you can to someone eating an oyster or someone's skin changing, like that's when an audience member really feels like I'm being attacked by what's happening on screen. But for me, I'd say it's just be respect, not be respectful, but understand that every film is built on like influences from other projects, and there's no harm in looking at them and being like, how did that scare me then? Can I possibly take or build a similar idea and give it to my audience as well?
And can you talk about the cast that you put them through? I do have to admit, your fisherman was pretty scary. I immediately will never trust an oyster fisherman in a basement, nonetheless.
Exactly. I'd say, look, being honest, the casting process for firstly starting with like with Rory and Helen who played Tony and Linda, so easy. We had auditions. We had quite clear things in mind. We were looking for this sort of like quiet desperation, I guess. It's sort of people who can't admit to each other what's going wrong, and just both of them straight away, absolutely perfect. And then for the fisherman, well, for Marvin, we we did an audition, but no one really had the right vibe. The way I can describe it is everyone was a bit too arch, a bit too big. I'm the villain kind of thing. And actually, for me, Marvin, he's also a tragic character. Like his backstory for me, he's trying to like save his family still, the oysters he considers his family. So I needed someone who could understand the quieter moments and be sinister. So there used to be this long-running TV show in the UK called The Bill, where Mark he'd been it for years. He was also in Quadrophenia. So when his showreel popped up and we were looking through, he had that right balance of like quiet authority and sort of like you're saying, like you wouldn't trust him, but the way he could make people fall into the trap was really interesting. Like he sort of had this earnestness about him that fine, everything around me is completely wrong. I shouldn't be here, but he kind of had something that felt a bit trustworthy about him or could play on Tony's emotions. And Mark just did such a great job in all the auditions. He totally understood the character from when I first met him. So it was easy. I mean, I hate to because casting isn't easy, but it just all three of these people just fell into place. And honestly, especially obviously a huge shout out to Mark. He's great as the villain, but I feel Rory, carries the film in a really good way, and I think he's a good everyman.
And one more thing is that I always find about horror short films, it's for a lot of them, it could lead into a proof of concept into
Sure.
a larger feature film. Is there any thought about that for Pearls?
Being honest, no. When I first came up with Pearls, in my mind it was like this is a contained story. I want to leave hints of the world. There's obviously bigger stuff that's happened with Marvin specifically. And one thing I feel that's really important is like your short story, your short film should be the story. Like you don't want to leave like, oh, I didn't solve this mystery. No, the mystery has to happen and finish on screen. And you can imagine what could happen next. But the more I've been thinking about it, and the more people are like, "Oh, could you do something?" I was thinking maybe a rom-com between Marvin and Annabelle, the giant oyster on the wall, and what happened to get them there.
You know what? Who knows? So for audiences in the future, where do they have more opportunities to watch pearls?
Yeah, so we're going to be playing. We've got a few more festivals coming up. So we're going to Norway. We've got a festival in Italy. We're off to Celluloid Screams, which is in the UK, one of the bigger horror festivals. Then we're off to Utah to Film Quest. So if anyone's going to any of those, you can catch it there. Um, Unfortunately, at the moment, it's still on its festival run, so it won't be till probably next year it's got wider release.
Well said. Well, Alastair, thank you very much for speaking to us about pearls. I mean, it is a delightful, and I'm not even sure if I want to, look at any oysters in the near future.
Well, give them a try. I've still eaten them once in a while, though I look a bit closer every time this time round.
Well said. Thank you very much. Let's do this
Thank you.
again next time.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much. Appreciate that. Goodbye.